All right, welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andy Mack. Let's continue to dive into the latest there in this ongoing conflict in Iran, and we're learning new information. Axios reporting that the U.S. is weighing whether to send in special forces to seize some of Iran's nuclear stockpile. This here on social media, Barak Ravid posting it, saying the U.S. weighing this special forces to secure a stockpile of a highly enriched uranium at a later stage in the war. Preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon is one of President Trump's stated war objectives. Any operation to seize the material would likely require U.S. or Israeli troops on Iranian soil, navigating heavily fortified underground facilities in the middle of this war. And we saw Operation Midnight Hammer last summer in that 12-day war. So we'll see what comes of this. But let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox. Bring into the conversation from Axios energy reporter Ben Geman. Ben, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. We talk a lot about nuclear. We talk a lot about oil and the energy artery in that region. What's the latest? What are you focusing on right now?
Yeah, so I think first of all, thank you for having me on. What everybody is watching this evening is what is going to happen to the price of oil when Asian trading markets open tonight, right? I think there's a very real chance that we could see crude oil prices rise above $100 per barrel for the first time since 2022. Now, this is a very unpredictable conflict, and I think, one thing to watch are the sort of politics of this and how the White House is going to be trying to mitigate the rise in crude oil prices. I don't think they can stop it, but I think that there are certain levers they have been trying to pull, both in terms of messaging and in terms of policy, to sort of limit the hit that consumers are going to be taking. But there's no avoiding that hit. As I think probably a lot of your viewers already know, we've seen gasoline prices move up about 45 cents per gallon since this conflict started. And diesel prices, I think this doesn't get quite enough attention. Diesel prices have gone up even more. And while most people don't use diesel for their personal vehicles, of course, the cost of diesel just ripples everywhere throughout the economy, right? Because of, any type of goods you need that move along the roads and so forth, that price eventually gets filtered into those prices as well. So there is a real economic hit here, but a lot is going to depend on how quickly or not quickly transit can resume through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, that is a very good point. We saw and heard last week that there might be some indications to mitigate that. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary as well, potentially coming through. How much of a lag is there, though? Even if the White House does something immediately, the Strait of Hormuz obviously not open, anything they can do. Is it on a delay no matter what the United States and the White House does?
It is. That's right. There's a term that economists tend to use when looking at gasoline markets and other types of petroleum markets, where they say that the price goes up like a rocket and comes down like a feather, right? And so to the extent that we are going to see to the extent that we're already seeing price spikes, they are going to have risen more quickly than they will come down. And I think, some other interesting context here is that even if none of this was occurring, we would be seeing a little bit of a rise in gasoline prices, obviously much more modest. And that's for a bunch of sort of humdrum reasons, I suppose, right? You've got the refiners who are switching over from their winter blends to their summer blends, which have different environmental requirements. You've got spring breaks starting in different places, so more people hitting the road. You've got seasonal refinery maintenance. So, prices were already going to be moving up a little bit anyway, but this has, of course, put that increase really put it on steroids.
And we heard from the president talking about this, talking to other reporters that we've spoken to about exactly the impacts. And it feels like they were aware of this, maybe not to the magnitude in which it does. But are we surprised that something hasn't happened already? And what might the White House do to mitigate some of these impacts?
Yeah, the number of levers that they can pull are not zero, but they are limited. I mean, some of the policy announcements that we've had so far is that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is one of our sort of export finance agencies, could be providing shippers with some type of, emergency political risk insurance products and guarantees. That could perhaps give a little bit of confidence. You had the president floating the idea of naval escorts, but in all honesty, I think as long as this conflict is going on, you are going to see a dramatic reduction in the number of shippers that are willing to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the White House is also looking at other ways to get some more barrels out there. You saw last week the Treasury Department issued a limited 30-day waiver for certain sanctions on Russian petroleum for India specifically to be able to refine that. So on some level, there's kind of a whack-a-mole effect here in the sense of while we're taking on one geopolitical rival in Iran, this is something that's going to accrue at least a little bit to the benefit of the Kremlin. Now, that said, the Treasury Department was very quick to say, look, we're talking about barrels that are largely already on the water. This is a limited waiver. This is not some big gift to Russia. It's something that's going to materially help them, but it certainly doesn't hurt.
Yeah, there's so many push and pulls with this global world economy in terms of this. You mentioned diesel because we talk about that. Maybe people don't put it in your cars. Noted that, but they use it for transport of goods and services kind of across the country. Are there any other indirect impacts from this being felt in terms of jet fuel, in terms of other kind of facets to what's going on, the ripple effects, the aftershocks?
Oh, absolutely. The transit through the Strait of Hormuz affects the global economy in a lot of different ways. So you have, for example, products that are necessary for the development of fertilizers for crops, and you've got all sorts of other industrial goods going through there. So this eventually does ripple down to agricultural costs, and by extension to grocery costs. Now, the natural gas rise, if there's some better news for the U.S. is that while the oil market is an incredibly interconnected global thing, the natural gas market is a little bit less so. It is a global market in a lot of respects, but Europe, for example, is heavily reliant on liquefied natural gas, and a lot of that from Qatar goes through the Strait of Hormuz. That's shut down right now. So we're seeing some very high spikes in European natural gas prices. The U.S., we're a little bit more insulated from that. So, in terms of people's winter, heating costs and eventually cooling costs, those are going to be, we are seeing some increase, but it's nowhere near as stark as some other countries are seeing.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Looking at some of this video, and obviously going through there is very difficult, the Strait of Hormuz. Is there anything else the United States is doing? We talk about ships in the Strait of Hormuz getting through that direction. What else are you monitoring in the region? Because we talk about the stock market and how investors are trying to get ahead. They're trying to have any advantage you can. We see the same thing with oil, where some indicators on the ground might show what's coming in the future. Are we seeing any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think traders are watching a number of things. Certainly what's going on with the Strait would be top of mind, but another big risk here is that this conflict, and we're already seeing this a little bit, can expand to sort of hit other regional energy producing infrastructure, right? So the kind of worst case scenario would be that there are large scale successful strikes on Saudi Arabian oil well infrastructure, processing infrastructure, export infrastructure, and we have not quite seen that yet. But certainly already we've seen effects that storage is starting to fill up simply because the oil just can't move from a lot of countries, whether that's the UAE or Kuwait and others. But yes, a lot of what's known as the geopolitical risk premium. So that's this idea that even in the absence of any physical disruption, you tend to see prices go up when you just have any very dicey geopolitical situation. Certainly that's one thing that traders are looking for. You did have Energy Secretary Chris Wright today saying that while there have been some impacts on Iranian energy infrastructure, that is not a military target of the U.S. right now. We'll have to see how that plays out. We'll have to see what the Israelis do. But yes, to your question, one thing that traders are watching extraordinarily carefully is what happens to the sort of vast constellation of different types of onshore wells, production, processing facilities, pipelines, export terminals, all of that. Even if that gets damaged, even an opening of the Strait of Hormuz, but that would create a whole series of other lasting effects, at least temporarily.
And we've seen Iran potentially target different civilian infrastructure, not necessarily oil spots, but in Bahrain already. So we could see that coming in the future. I want to ask you, because we're just a week into this Operation Epic Fury, as it continues on, depending on how the timeline goes, does it potentially get exponentially worse? How does the curve look if it continues on for some time?
Absolutely. The timing here is what's going to be really crucial. I mean, one interesting thing that I was reporting on last week is that given all of the sort of tremendous upheaval, until the end of last week, the rise in the price of oil was perhaps more modest than people would have expected. And from my reporting, that suggested that people did not think that this conflict was going to necessarily drag on for an extraordinarily long time, and or that there would be some success in getting things moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, of course, since then we've seen that geopolitical risk premium and those prices go up and up and up. And so, yes, the duration of this conflict will have a huge effect on how high prices ultimately go. Absolutely. So it's not only the kind of level of the disruption, and just in terms of barrels per day. And right now that's huge because as your viewers probably know, the Strait of Hormuz handles about a fourth of the world's maritime oil trade. But yes, the duration will matter at some point, start to matter just almost as much as the sort of level of disruption.
That's a very good point. All right, the final word, I'll leave it for you, Ben. What else are you monitoring? What else do you want to know before I let you go?
Yeah, one other thing that I'm looking at certainly, this is first and foremost in many ways a human tragedy. We're seeing loss of life. It's a very dangerous and difficult situation. If I may, though, I think the politics are also something to watch, right? I mean, President Trump obviously covets low gasoline prices at any time, especially during an election year. And this is coming at a time when the other big part of consumers' energy expenses, electricity prices, have also already been rising, right? And so one thing that's really very much on my mind is what is going to be the sort of midterm election fallout of these energy price spikes, regardless of how long they last.
All right, very good. Ben Geman there with Axios. Thank you so much for your time. So very fascinating to talk about some of these ripple effects around this, the impacts on the global world economy for this conflict in the Middle East. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.